Peter Schiff was right again, and that's the next guest on right now. Peter Schiff, thanks for joining us today on USA Watchdog. You've been warning about now the inflation. What's going on?
Yeah, well, first of all, the problem with the next Peter Schiff was right video is they don't have all the footage of everybody laughing at me as I make these predictions, because all those major news networks that used to have me on to make fun of me don't have me on anymore. And so we don't have the material to, or whoever, the Peter Schiff was right video was actually produced independently. I forget the guy's name. In fact, he ended up removing the video. So the original one that had the millions of views, and that was a lot of views back in 2009 because YouTube was pretty new. I mean, now there's lots of videos that have all these views, but that back then, it was actually one of the most viewed YouTube videos. But the guy eventually took it down, but there are still a few copies of it out there. I made a copy of it and put it up on my YouTube channel. But yeah, that material just doesn't exist anymore because all these networks stopped inviting me on. But of course, I have been making these forecasts on my own for a number of years. So there's plenty of video evidence, of me making these predictions. But the Federal Reserve, that was very dismissive of my warnings. And of course, I wasn't the only person out there. There were other people that were warning about the housing bubble and what was going to happen to the economy, to the financial system when that bubble inevitably popped. But the Federal Reserve was telling everybody not to listen to guys like me. In particular, even Janet Yellen, she gave a speech in which she basically dismissed all the warnings about the potential problems in the housing market and the mortgage market. So everybody, Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen, was telling everybody, don't worry. And even after, this was the most ridiculous part, even after the subprime market blew up and you had some major bankruptcies and you saw the collapse of those securities, even after that happened, you had Ben Bernanke assuring everybody that there was nothing to worry about, that what happened in subprime was contained, it was isolated to a small part of the mortgage market, that it wasn't going to spill over into the overall mortgage market, and it certainly wasn't going to hurt the economy. Nobody had to worry. And of course, then I was saying, look, everything I've been worrying about, all the warnings of the last few years, you can now see that I was right. Look at what's happening in subprime. But even after that happened, people still wouldn't admit that what I was saying all those years were right. They had to wait for the complete implosion, in the summer of 2008 with the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, and all these banks imploding and the stock market melting down. It actually took the crisis to vindicate me. But the same thing is happening now, because the inflation crisis and the dollar crisis that will ensue, this is a much bigger economic event that will have a far greater impact on the economy than the 2008 financial crisis. I've been warning about the consequences of all this money printing for years and years and years, and now finally you're really starting to see that. I mean, the government has been able to kind of bury the amount of inflation they've been creating, because of the CPI, because the CPI doesn't really capture the degree to which prices are going up. And so, it creates a false sense of confidence that we haven't had inflation when we have. But now prices are rising so rapidly that even the government's doctored CPI number can't hide it. And so it's obvious what's going on. We're getting these huge price increases across the board. And what is the Federal Reserve doing now? They're doing exactly what they did in 2007 after subprime blew up. They're telling everybody not to worry, that what they're seeing is transitory, right? So these big price increases, they're just going to magically go away, that somehow they're all related just to the economy getting started. And so it's just this good economy that is temporarily pushing up prices, but there's nothing to worry about because they're just going to magically come back down, and we're still going to be at 2% inflation. And so we can keep the printing presses going, pedal to the metal. We're going to have these huge deficits. We're going to print all this money, and there's nothing to worry about. Well, you better worry, because again, this crisis is much worse, will be much worse than '08 And unlike '08, nobody's getting a bailout. Because the reason the Federal Reserve was able to bail everybody out in 2008, 2009 was because they could print the money to fund the bailouts. But this next crisis, it's the dollar that is going to be in crisis. The dollar is going to be crashing, and they can't bail anybody out from a dollar crash because all they can do is print more dollars, which will just accelerate the collapse of the dollar.
I had, what's her name, Laryl, or Fed Governor Brainerd, a beautiful woman. But she was on just recently saying that, we have the tools in the toolbox and we can guide inflation lower. And this is what, to your point, they're telling us not to worry. Now, can the Fed guide inflation lower with the tools in their toolbox?
No, you'd think if Paul Volcker had those tools, don't you think he would have used them? Paul Volcker wasn't able to guide inflation lower. Interest rates went up to 20%. That's what brought inflation down. You can't guide it lower. They don't have the tools. They're just bluffing. I mean, maybe they have the tools, but it's impossible for them to use the tools. Because, if they wait until inflation really gets out of control before trying to fight it, which is what they've stated, that the Fed is saying, we are not going to err on the side of caution, which is what you normally do as a central banker, because there's an old adage, never let the inflation genie out of the bottle. So if there's a possibility that the genie might get out, well, you act preemptively. But what the Fed has said now is we're not going to do that. We're not going to do anything about the inflation genie until it's out of the bottle, and it's obviously out, right? And so the problem is you can't just get it back in. Because let's say they don't do anything about inflation until the CPI is 5% or 6%, and it'll probably end up being much higher than that. But let's say they wait until 5 or 6% inflation, and now they're like, okay, we're going to rein it back in again. Well, if interest rates are still at zero, how do you stop 5% inflation? I mean, you got to get interest rates above 5%. So you got to go from 0 to like 6%, without pass and go. You got to go straight there. Well, how are they going to do that? I mean, I don't even think they can get to 1% without completely imploding the entire economy. The problem is we have so much debt. Because of all the stimulus of the past, the Fed has loaded the country up with debt that they can't afford to fight inflation without collapsing that entire house of cards they spent the last 20 years erecting. So this is all a bluff. The one thing the Fed can't do is fight inflation, but the other thing they can't do is admit that they can't fight inflation, because that will create the problem even faster. So the whole thing is a bluff.